Good evening. I'm Nova Blake, and this is your complete political briefing for Sunday, March 29th, 2026. Tonight, the Pentagon prepares for possible ground operations inside Iran as the Department of Homeland Security shutdown enters its 43rd day with no end in sight. Let's get into it. Starting with the top stories from across the American political landscape. A nation on edge. The Pentagon is preparing options for weeks of limited ground operations inside Iran, potentially including raids on Karg Island and coastal sites near the Strait of Hormuz, according to United States officials. The plans, which stop short of a full invasion, would involve special operations and conventional infantry troops, exposing American personnel to Iranian drones, missiles, and ground fire. Whether President Trump will approve any of the plans remains uncertain. Millions took to the streets this weekend. Nationwide, No Kings protests swept all 50 states and dozens of countries on Saturday, with organizers calling it potentially the largest single nonviolent day of action in American history. More than 3,200 marches were planned, with demonstrators voicing anger over the war with Iran, rising gas prices, and the administration's immigration enforcement policies. In Los Angeles, 75 people were arrested following a dispersal order after a downtown rally. The Department of Homeland Security shutdown is now in its 43rd day, and Congress remains completely deadlocked. The Senate passed a bipartisan bill early Friday to fund most of the department, but the House rejected it in a 213 to 203 vote, choosing instead to pass its own 60-day extension that included funding for immigration and customs enforcement. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called the House plan dead on arrival, and both chambers have now left for a 2-week Easter recess with no deal in sight. A diplomatic opening in the Iran war may be taking shape. President Trump said Sunday aboard Air Force One that Iran has agreed to most of a 15-point American peace plan, conveyed through Pakistan as an intermediary. Trump also said Iran has agreed to ship oil to the United States as a show of good faith, while U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed he expects direct meetings with Iranian officials this week. Tehran has not publicly confirmed the terms, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has signaled continued skepticism of Washington's position. Oil prices have now surged more than 50% since the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran began 5 weeks ago. Iran's partial blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is cutting as much as 20 million barrels of oil per day from global markets, what analysts are calling the largest oil shock in history. The economic ripple effects are spreading globally, with Australia announcing free public transit in 2 states to ease the burden on consumers facing surging fuel costs. Former FBI Director James Comey has been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Florida as part of the Trump administration's sweeping grand conspiracy investigation. The probe, led by U.S. Attorney Jason Redding Quinones of the Southern District of Florida, has now issued more than 130 subpoenas targeting Obama and Biden-era intelligence and law enforcement officials. Comey's subpoena relates specifically to his alleged role in drafting a January 2017 intelligence community assessment on Russian election interference. President Trump said Sunday he is still weighing whether to seize Iran's Karg Island, which handles 90% of Tehran's oil exports. Speaking to reporters, the president said he has a lot of options, but that U.S. forces would likely need to remain there for an extended period if such an action were taken. The island was already struck by U.S. forces on March 13th as part of a broader campaign targeting Iranian military and naval infrastructure. Former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores appeared in a New York federal courtroom this week, continuing their narco-terrorism trial following their capture by U.S. forces in January. The U.S. military operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, was launched on January 3rd in Caracas, resulting in the arrest of Maduro on charges including conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism and cocaine importation. The unprecedented operation drew widespread international condemnation, and the case is being closely watched as it proceeds through the courts. President Trump voiced sharp frustration with NATO this week, saying he is very disappointed that allied nations have not offered military support during the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. Trump accused member nations of failing Washington despite decades of American defense spending on their behalf. The remarks have renewed transatlantic tensions, with European governments publicly declining to join the military campaign while quietly seeking diplomatic off-ramps. The FBI has seized hundreds of boxes of 2020 election ballots from Fulton County, Georgia, and a federal court fight is now underway over those records. Fulton County officials have sued the Justice Department demanding the ballots be returned, with a witness at a federal hearing this week describing chaos on the day of the January raid. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard was present during the raid at the request of President Trump, a presence that has drawn scrutiny given her role as the nation's top intelligence officer. Now turning to Washington and the latest actions from the current administration. Here are 10 significant developments from the administration this week. President Trump signed a presidential memorandum on Friday directing Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin and Office of Management and Budget Director Russ Vought to immediately resume pay for the approximately 61,000 Transportation Security Administration officers who have worked without compensation since the Department of Homeland Security funding lapsed on February 14th. The administration said TSA workers should begin seeing back pay as early as Monday, March 30th. Trump framed the action as an emergency measure, saying the administration will take action where Congress has not. On March 26th, President Trump signed an executive order requiring all federal contracts to include a clause prohibiting contractors and their subcontractors from engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. The order authorizes contracting agencies to cancel, terminate, or suspend contracts and to suspend or debar contractors for noncompliance. It marks the latest in a series of administration actions targeting DI programs across the public and private sectors. The White House released a national framework for artificial intelligence legislation earlier this month, calling on Congress to establish a unified federal standard for AI policy rather than allowing states to set their own rules. The proposal includes protections specifically for children, limits on legal liability for AI developers, and language that would preempt state laws the administration considers barriers to innovation. Critics across the political spectrum have pushed back, arguing that states need the ability to regulate AI while Congress debates a federal approach. The Federal Emergency Management Agency Review Council was formally continued by executive order on March 24th, signaling the administration's ongoing evaluation of the agency's structure and operations. The council was originally established last year as part of broader administration efforts to reassess and potentially restructure how the federal government responds to natural disasters. The Trump administration moved to formally extend a ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion practices to the federal contracting sector, following earlier executive orders that had already eliminated DI programs within federal agencies, the military, and the Foreign Service. The Office of Management and Budget has been directed to issue compliance guidance identifying economic sectors at the highest risk of engaging in what the order calls racially discriminatory DI activity. The administration's immigration enforcement priorities came into sharp focus this week as White House border czar Tom Homan indicated he is considering deploying immigration and customs enforcement agents to airports to fill staffing gaps caused by the TSA shortage. Homan indicated that ICE deployment would depend on whether TSA workers receive their back pay in coming days. The move reflects the administration's broader posture of using immigration enforcement resources across multiple domestic functions. President Trump renewed public calls this week for the Senate to eliminate the legislative filibuster, arguing that the 60-vote threshold is preventing Republicans from passing key priorities, including Department of Homeland Security funding. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has repeatedly said there is not sufficient support within the Republican conference to end the filibuster. Trump posted on Truth Social that Democrats will make a deal now if they believe Republicans might terminate the filibuster. The administration's Grand Conspiracy Probe, run by U.S. Attorney Jason Redding Quinones of the Southern District of Florida, has now produced more than 130 subpoenas targeting former officials from the Obama and Biden administrations. In addition to Comey, subpoena recipients include former CIA Director John Brennan, former FBI counterintelligence agent Peter Strzok, and former FBI attorney Lisa Page. The administration's stated theory is that Democratic officials conspired to undermine Trump from his 2016 election through his federal indictments in 2023. The administration has continued to push the Save America Act legislation requiring photo identification to cast a ballot as a condition linked to the Department of Homeland Security funding negotiations. President Trump urged Senate Republicans this week to attach the elections bill to any DHS funding deal, a move Senate Majority Leader Thune and other Republican senators have publicly resisted, saying it lacks the votes needed to clear the Senate's procedural threshold. House Republicans passed an 8-week measure Friday night to fund all of DHS at current spending levels through May 22nd, including funding for IC and Customs and border protection. The bill passed 213 to 203, with 3 Democrats crossing party lines to vote in favor. The Senate, which had already passed its own bill excluding IC funding, has now left for recess, leaving the shutdown unresolved with no clear path to a deal for at least 2 weeks.